pleasure to visit Purdue. I've been in Florida for a couple of years, so I feel like I almost forgot how the winter feels like in the Midwest, and I hope I could see some snow before I head back to Florida. Okay, so for today, I will give a presentation on a digital twin initiative in acute care medicine. I'm aware that this is the last ICON seminar and probably the only one that has a strict healthcare focus. So I think comparing to other industries like manufacturing, supply chain, transportation, healthcare used to be less engineered, but it has become growingly automated and intelligent. And actually, this acute care medicine or critical care delivery has attracted growing attention during the COVID pandemic. You probably have heard that ventilator shortage, ICU room overcrowding, and the staff burnout in the news during the pandemic. So the critical care crisis really urged the new methods and new solutions to ensure the timely and accurate delivery of care in the acute care environment. So I believe digital twins are one of such solutions that could revolutionize critical care delivery. So for today's talk, I will share our journey to bring digital twin technology into critical care medicine. So because the scope is very broad, so I will not focus on the specific technology or algorithms, but will give a general introduction of the background and the clinical needs that motivated this research. I will briefly introduce two of our projects, building models on the patient level and the system level, and share our thoughts about the future research directions. So first, I would like to acknowledge this is really indeed a team effort. And our team includes physicians in different specialties who provide the domain knowledge, and also healthcare information technology experts who build the digital infrastructure, and also the core team, including critical care intensivists, medical educators, biostatisticians, and engineers. And this project is funded by NSF. Over the past decades, we have witnessed several technological revolutions that had significantly impacted all aspects of life. The advent of electronic medical records, wearable devices, and the Internet of Medical Things has led to an explosion of data related to disease, biology, and care delivery. And in addition, we have the 5G communication development, positive policy encouragement from various countries, and the research achievements in omics, and even the unexpected pandemic. These factors all contribute to the popularity of digital twins in healthcare. The digital twins have found many applications in healthcare. Precision medicine is one of the most important areas. The goal here is to be able to create a digital replica of the human body. It allows for in silico clinical trials, which can be used for drug development or treatment recommendation. Another example here is the personalized health or real-time monitoring. So the objective is to monitor the physical activities of patients in real time. The wearable sensory data can be leveraged to remotely monitor patients' well-being and also estimate risk of adverse events like detecting fall for elderly patients. In contrast, system management is a less explored area in digital twins. According to a rapid literature review, the use of digital twins for healthcare system management is only an emerging topic. So for our project, we focus on critical care or acute care, which is typically delivered to patients with life-threatening conditions. And for these patients, diagnostic and therapeutic fidelity in the early hours is paramount. So physicians termed these hours like the first 6 hours since the admission as a golden hour and the first ICU stay as the silver day. And they believe a virtual counterpart to the critically ill patients with decision support capabilities has the potential to enable accurate and timely decision-making. So the concept of virtual patients is not new, and virtual patient simulations have been developed to train medical professionals in a variety of clinical settings. However, only moderate effectiveness in practice was reported. It reveals that most of the off-the-shelf simulation tools overly simplified the patient pathways, like the linear text-based scenarios or decision trees that progressed on a limited number of handcrafted pathways. As such, students have very limited ability to learn from their mistakes, or can only explore very few scenarios that are far from what could happen in reality. So this motivates us to develop simulation models that are non-linear, non-decision-based, data-driven computational simulation. And such simulation tools are necessary to provide medical students with a more realistic or near real-life experience of treating patients in critical care. Okay, so to fill this research gap, the team proposed an expert rule-based computational patient simulation for educational purposes. So the core idea here is that instead of directly model a patient, let us distill a patient into a limited number of biomarkers that describe the clinical progression of major organ systems. Just a little bit background. According to statistics, many patients admitted to ICU suffer certain organ failures or need some level of organ support. And during COVID, we noticed that more than 75% of the patients in ICU need some level of respiratory support. So our expert rules here are trying to define the action and interaction among clinical markers that will dictate the progression of the disease conditions. And our goal is to be able to model the trajectory of these biomarkers over time. So this is to mimic the evolvement of patient's clinical condition. And this information is critical for clinicians to make treatment and diagnostic decisions. So our goal is to develop such a tool and use it primarily for educational purposes. And in future, we would like to make it into a test bed for in silico clinical research and even for bedside decision support. And the expert rules currently are refined through a Delphi consensus process. So we gather a lot of physicians with expertise in different aspects of the patients, and they discuss and come up with a set of rules that we will adopt in our simulation model. Here, I just want to highlight the rationale why critical care could be an ideal environment to model and validate virtual patients. So this is a very crude comparison between chronic care diseases and critical care. So first, I think patients, when they are admitted to ICU, they are closely monitored. So we have a multitude of data coming from various sources like sensors, monitoring devices, and clinical notes. So this is a data-rich environment. And also, the disease cycle is short. So for the expert rules, their turnaround time is very short. So we expect to have less censored samples in our data. In addition, we have a better control of the confounders. So for instance, if we think about the chronic disease, over the decades, there could be change in the standard of care, like the rollout of new medications and new treatment plans. Whereas in critical care, we could consider the validation can be performed rapidly within multiple iterations in a relatively short time domain. So all this offered us a great opportunity to develop models of virtual patients from the clinical perspective. Okay. Questions? Right. So in terms of the digital infrastructure, my collaborators in Mayo have developed a new information system called AMP, Acute Care Multi-Patient Viewer, aiming to reduce the cognitive load of clinicians and overcome the shortcomings of the traditional EMR design. So in this unit view, the patient data are organized according to the ICU layout. So the clinicians can have a quick glance about the ICU occupancy and also the overall status of the patients who are currently staying in the ICU. And if you zoom into individual patients, you will be able to filter the patients who have abnormal vital signs or organ dysfunctions. And the organ dysfunction is color coded. So red represents urgent, red represents critical, yellow represents urgent, and white represents normal. So echoing our virtual patient simulation, here the status of the 7 major organ systems are primarily presented in the patient snapshot. In addition to the patient snapshot, you can also look at the trajectory of the important biomarkers. These biomarkers are collected from sensors, monitoring devices, lab tests, and also diagnostic examinations. They are sampled with different frequencies. So like here, we have continuous data about the vital signs like the heart rate and blood pressure. Well, we might only have like 1 or 2 data points of certain biomarkers throughout a patient's entire ICU stay. And what is more problematic is that at some time, physicians might not even have access to many of the biomarkers during the time of decision making. So our goal is to be able to simulate these trajectories, and we do not need to have the accurate prediction of the values of these individual biomarkers, but we need to know whether the biomarkers are in the normal range or not. So that is our goal. So here, I recorded a video about this application. So let me see if I can play the sound.
This is the user interface of the virtual patient simulation application. It works like a serious game. The user will evaluate and treat the patient as they would do during the admission and rounding process in the ICU. The goal is to stabilize a patient within the first 6 hours after admission. You'll be given the instructions about this application. It includes different views like the ICU room view and the EHR chart view. The way you interact with a simulated patient is through making different types of orders, including labs, imaging studies, medications, among others. When you finish reading the instructions, you will be led to a menu that allows you to select from a couple of pre-programmed patient cases. Here, patient case 2 is selected. You will be first given a short introduction of the case, like what is typically done during the admission and rounding process. Then you can review the patient's history, which includes the allergy history, medications used at home, the medical history, and whether this is a do not resuscitate patient or not. With this in mind, the next step would be to review the patient's chart information. The major biomarkers are presented in the form of vital signs, examination results, lab results, and diagnostic tests. You're able to simulate the progression of the patient's clinical condition. Let us just try advancing time without making any interventions. It tells you that if nothing is done, highly likely the patient's GCS score will become very low and airway obstruction will develop. To treat the patient, let us reset the case. Here you can make orders like ordering additional diagnostic tests. This will provide you more evidence before making a final decision. In this case, because the respiratory system is abnormal, I can order a CT scan at the chest area. The order made will show up in the intervention category. After about an hour, I'm given the CT chest result that the images of the lungs are normal for this patient. Because the respiratory rate is high and also the oxygen saturation is low, I would consider giving the patient basic respiratory support, like providing the patient oxygen. Then I can run the simulation and see whether this treatment can help resolve the issue and stabilize the patient. After each session, before you reset the case, you can go to the event logs to see what's under the hood. As a developer's version, the rules that are triggered at each step are shown here. This would also help the users to reason why a patient's trajectory would present in this way. When you finish the session, you can provide feedback about your user experience to the developers.
Yeah, this is a demonstration of the application that's currently under development. So I do hope I know how to treat that patient, but unfortunately, I don't have really the medical training sufficient to save that patient. But I found this a fun game to play. Actually, we would like to make this proposed patient simulation scalable and robust. So here we introduce an application architecture designed to overcome several challenges inherent in the dynamic realm of healthcare simulation. So specifically, this software architecture comprises three main components. The first one is a cross-platform front-end application that the clinicians and training use to run the simulation, like what I just showed in the previous slide. And this front application is constructed to seamlessly scale to accommodate a great number of users with sporadic or correlated usage patterns, like in the classroom or in the patient batch set. And the second component is a cloud-hosted simulation engine that performs all the necessary computations for each user simulation on demand. The third component is a graph database that hosts all the expert rules used by the simulation engine to drive each simulation. So this architecture is designed to operate reliably under various conditions while ensuring fault tolerance and user maintainability. So given the large number of expert rules and the evolving nature of expert rules development, we decided to use a graph database to store and efficiently query the expert rules. So currently we have about 70 clinical markers and over 300 expert rules, and we expect to keep adding new rules to the database. So using the graph database has a couple advantages. So first, instead of looping over all the 300 rules multiple times, here we could search the rules based on the graph structure. So imagine if the graph has a tree structure, we could use like that first search to effectively query the rules that are relevant to the current state of the patient, instead of going through all the feasible rules in the system. A second advantage is that we can better visualize the relationships among these clinical markers, and this is helpful for the developers to diagnose the program and debug the program. And also, since we have a separate graph database and simulation engine, so we can enhance or develop the graph database without affecting the simulation logic. This is a proof of concept example of the simulation. So in this toy example, we have 5 biomarkers there, and we crafted 17 artificial expert rules. So we need to transform the narrative expert rules crafted by physicians into formalized rules that are programmable. So in this example, for these rules, we categorize them by the cause, like what is the trigger event, and the effect, like how the biomarker would change and when the biomarker would change. So for the patient simulation, the organ systems are modeled as autonomous agents, and their states are represented by the states of these major clinical markers. And each time we query the database, the input includes the current states and the history, because not all the rules are memoryless. And we also need to keep track of whether an intervention is given and whether there are other case-specific information. This is because at any time, multiple rules could be effective, and we need to be able to calculate the joint effect of these rules on individual organ markers. And the new states will be sampled based on the probabilistic relationship and updated accordingly. So in this toy example, we show a sample path of the trajectory of these 5 biomarkers. And we also are able to show the rules that are triggered at each step of the simulation. As I commented in the demonstration, the rules are important for the medical students and trainees to learn the medical science behind the scene. Okay. So we did a internal test at Mayo Clinic. The objective is to assess the usability, workload, and acceptance of this simulation software. We recruited 35 internal medicine residents. They played with this software and described their experience using a think aloud and semi-structured interview. We also collected the system usability scale and the NASA task load index. So the survey results showed that we have good software usability and low to moderate workload. The residents were inclined to use this application during and prior to their critical care rotations, but they also highlighted like several limitations and areas for improvement. So in particular, they want to have more interactive features for this application. For instance, they would like to have a debriefing after each simulation session so as to assess their performance, and possibly a performance score that can be provided to help them maybe look at their study effectiveness. And they also cautioned that because this current simulation application is built entirely based on the AMP system, so this might not be friendly to people outside of Mayo Clinic. So they would suggest some improvement in the user interface design as well. Okay, so these are really constructive feedbacks, and the team would like to revise the application according to these inputs. Our ultimate goal is to make it into a patient digital twin. So the current application actually has the interface to access to the database and the EMR for Mayo Clinic internal users. So now we have the function to import data to the simulation model. First, we think this could help us to set up the baseline case conditions for individual patients, like populating the case introduction and the initial patient snapshot. And also for the two-way communication, we expect to implement it with a human-in-the-loop design. So we have the clinician to look at the prediction of the patient trajectory on the virtual patients, and the clinician can compare different treatment plans on the virtual patient, and eventually implement a chosen treatment plan on the actual patient. And we expect to prospectively validate the patient simulation by comparing the performance of the virtual patient and the actual patient's trajectory. Any questions? Right, so here a parallel effort is to validate the expert rules using a data-driven approach. This is a graphical representation of the physiological rules provided by the physicians. Some of the rules, like the interventional rules, they are really reliable because they come from like controlled clinical trials, whereas for certain rules, like these physiological rules, they definitely need to be better calibrated. So our task here is to learn or validate the rules using clinical data. So the data we had now is similar to the data presented in the information system. So we have the static data like patient's demographic and socioeconomic information and their medical history. So these data are like constant and they don't change over a patient's entire ICU stay. We also have continuous data like vital signs collected from patients through like wearable sensors, but it's not in the waveform format. Is like downsampled, like we have the sample interval around like 15 minutes or even an hour. And for the intermittent data, we have like lab results, medications, and the procedures on the patients. For certain variables, it's very sparse, like we only have 1 or 2 measurements for a patient's entire ICU stay. There are many practical challenges regarding analyzing a large data set like this. There are a lot of missing data points and coding errors and artifacts in the data points. And in addition to these practical challenges, so for the graph, you can tell that we actually have numerous feedback loops in describing the interactions of these biomarkers. It is uncommon to have feedback loops in chemical or biological processes, but it's annoying because we cannot decompose the joint distribution based on the conditional independence properties because of the feedback loops. One way to break the loop is unrolling it over time. And this is a good option because actually those biomarkers represent random processes. But it also entails a challenge in learning the structure of these dynamic networks, because even for this very simple cyclic graph, there are numerous ways to unfold it, because for each edge between 2 nodes, we need to determine whether it's intra-time slice connectivity or it's an inter-time slice connectivity. And we also need to determine whether there are permanent persistent effect, like whether there is an arrow pointing from Z0 to Z1. And also there is no Markovian property based on clinical assumptions. So we also need to handle like different order of memories when learning this type of graphs. So this is still an ongoing research, and we welcome any critiques and suggestions on this topic.
Yeah, so actually I have 2 questions in here. So one is related to the symptoms, right? For different symptoms, maybe have like different treatments. So somebody may have like combined of different symptoms. Then how you make sure that all of the possible like expert rules are already like embedded on the platform? That's the first question.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a hard question to answer. So I think like in medical science, there are a lot of like unknowns. So what we can do the best is to accurately represent our current knowledge. So the goal of crafting this graph representation is to better present the known knowledge to to people new to this area, like medical residents, so that they can quickly make decisions by leveraging this additional support from this type of like simulation tools. And one of the reasons why we want to characterize the network is that eventually we need to be able to characterize the joint distribution of all the biomarkers under different conditions. So that entails a challenging work about learning a complex graph. So I hope.
So yeah, then this the second question related to the graph, like how do you determine the different parameters, like the weight of the node or the links in the graph?
So I think like so for the nodes, we actually categorize it as categorical variables, and they are essentially random processes. So you can imagine if we have the Markovian property at the current moment, we stay at a normal state, we have different probability or transition rates to jump to a different state like abnormal. So this is currently how we categorize the individual nodes here. And the relationships represent a conditional independency. So like if you look at like a graph like this, so conditioning on like Z0 and yeah, so like these factors have the joint distribution can be decomposed if you dictate certain conditional independency relationship. So here we want to categorize like what variable is affected by another variable, and what is like the condition and the joint distribution of these variables presented together.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. This is very interesting. I'm curious as to the implementation of your interventions, the control feedback in the system. So when your user does an action inside of the system, is it just moving it to another node in this kind of expert rule graph? Is that kind of what's happening to the patient's state? Or is it more of a, they'll implement some like number of intervention and then the graph determines what's happening?
Yeah, so if you don't do like anything, the state of these variables will still evolve according to certain rules. So imagine it's like a Markovian process, right? So each rule will like let's say we have like 3 random variables, and with time they could be in a different state. So this is pretty much like a state space model, but the rules might change the conditional dependency of these variables. So when you have a rule and the rule is triggered, it will dictate like what would be the probability of a certain variable in a certain state at a certain time.
Okay, so the control input is changing that distribution of how likely they are to move to another state.
Right, exactly. So you can imagine it's like a conditional probability of like YT given YT minus 1 and other like XT minus 1, etc. And you want to estimate how the transition is dictated by the presence of other biomarkers in the system.
Interesting. And does this expert rule graph account for a patient having multiple like issues happening at the same time? Like if they're, because it looks like this is, you're in one state at a time, but you could potentially have 5 things happening. They might even be unrelated.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So currently, when I mentioned that we have that 300 rules, we actually created different graphs to represent certain common conditions in our critical care patients. So we are not yet to be able to collapse those graphs into one, because that's beyond the knowledge of the current medical science. But we hope that by leveraging like advanced artificial intelligence and technology, we will be able to automate this rule discovery. So parallel our effort in the group is to use some neural network models to learn the progression of these biomarkers. But there is a trade-off between these two approaches, because by using a graph model, we would have better interpretability so that we know what's under the hood, whereas if we implement a neural network-based model, we can hardly use this as an educational tool, but that could be a better set decision support too, because of a better accuracy. And I think that would have the capability to incorporate the problem you just mentioned, like having a lot of things going on at the same time.
Very, very interesting work.
Okay. Yeah, I do have a different topic that I also want to share. So this project is along the same line of reducing diagnostic errors and delay, and is funded by the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality. So for that virtual patient simulation, we focus on treating individual patients, and we aim to enhance our knowledge and competency to treat the patient timely with good fidelity. Whereas we are aware that, like sometimes system level factors like the staffing and the capacity planning could have more impact than the individual performance on patient outcomes. So to put it simple, the delay of the treatment might not be caused that you do not know how to treat the patient, but it could be caused that you just have a lot of patients to be treated at the same time, but you cannot treat multiple patients simultaneously. So when you sequence a patient, some patients will have to wait. In short, the diagnostic performance in the current system is not resilient to the environment or the work system change. And the lack of knowledge to handle such change is further reviewed in the COVID pandemic. That's why we heard a lot about like ventilator shortage, ICU overcrowding, and staff burnout. So for this project, we aim to answer the questions like what are the contributors to the variability in diagnostic performance in the ICU, and can we build a model to represent diagnostic performance under various operational conditions and use that model to suggest where the vulnerabilities or failure points might exist. So with these questions in mind, we would like to explore how the system level factors could affect decision-making performance. And the combination of people, skills, processes, culture, and technology, they all determine how we deliver care as we adapt to new challenges. So here we abstract away from the actual decision-making and conceptualize it into a production process. So the inputs, like the raw materials, are the data and information from the patients and the environment. And through some unknown processes, we obtain the final product, which is the action plan, like the orders mentioned here. So we assume the system workload factors would impact both the input and also the production processes. And the factors we consider here primarily are the patient sensors, like how many patients are in the ICU at this time point, and also the characterization of the patients, like how many patients are suffering like a severe illness and has a high mortality risk. And also we count like how many new patients, like patients who are newly admitted to the ICU, because treatment planning is a very cognitive intensive task. So we use data to help us understand the impact, and we aligned the longitudinal patient data according to the actual time, so it becomes cross-sectional at any time slice, and we are able to see like at this time how many patients are there in the ICU and what are the status of these patients. So in ICU, the number of nurses is proportional to the number of patients because of the regulations that dictate a certain nurse to patient ratio, whereas like for the physicians, like the clinicians, their workload is quite elastic. So the same physician team could take care of patients ranging from like 5 to 20 in the ICU. And this motivated us to look at their diagnostic performance under varying ICU census conditions. So here I just wanted to highlight the main findings. So the figure here represents the throughput of the production system as a function of patient census. It is interesting to see that the curve is bended at some point. It suggests that the production rate is reduced. So the interpretation here is that as the ICU becomes busy, the capacity of that distributed cognitive system is constrained. And the direct consequence is that the capability to prescribe more orders is impaired. And you might also notice another breakpoint, and that is possibly due to when the ICU is close to full, because in this case, the maximum bed capacity is 32. So at that point, the unit will slow down the admission process. So they determine not to admit new patients, and that relieves certain burden of the care team so that they can catch up with the backlogs. But I think the key takeaway message here is that you cannot single out the diagnostic performance of a patient from the ICU environment that a patient stays in. Or conversely, we want to build a resilient system so that the performance is less impaired by these system or workload factors. So we want a system that could better avoid the cognitive breakdown to ensure diagnostic excellence. Okay, so the vision for an adaptable, resilient acute care hospital will be built upon like how and what data you could collect and the platform analytical capability to transfer data into knowledge, and eventually the system design that allows us to transfer knowledge into the right actions to improve patient outcomes and also staff well-being. So these are some guiding principles for the adaptable resilient care model. These are really strong motives for us to introduce the digital twin technology to enable rapid prototyping, automation, and data-driven decision-making. So modeling the ICU is far more challenging than modeling individual patients. This is essentially because it's a system of systems and patients are just one component of the ICU system. So if we follow a patient's pathway, this patient could be admitted through the emergency department or an operating room after surgery. And this patient could also come from floor because of an elevated status. And in the ICU, the patient will receive some standard care procedures depending on the acuity level of the patient. And the patient also generate a lot of data or signals. And the providers, they interact with the patients either through a direct in-person communication or through the data points that a patient generated. So the clinicians and patients here are the autonomous agents in the system. And these the clinicians need to manage their task and coordinate their task as a team. And each patient will undergo the transitions in their health status based on the severity of illness and the stability of their condition. And the intervention is aimed to stabilize the patient or correct the condition. And for the data points, the nature and frequency of data generation depends on the patient's health status and also the action of the healthcare team and the environment, like whether the equipment is currently available in the hospital or not. And this data also impose a tremendous cognitive burden to the clinicians. So you can tell this system is very complex. And in order to be able to model it, we need to place the agents and their interactions among the other processes happening in the ICU, also including the design, like the capacity, the staffing, and other operational constraints. For model calibration, we rely on the data collected from the ICU and the domain knowledge provided by the clinicians. For patients, since the goal here is not for diagnostic purposes, we conceptualize the patient pathways at a very high level, like a multi-state model. And the objective here is to be able to predict the states of the patient through time. So after labeling the hourly states, we'll be able to see the patient pathways as a cohort. And in particular, you'll be able to see that most of the elevated transitions happen in the first 6 to 24 hours of an ICU stay. So this also echoes the operational nature that, you know, physicians feels that the first 24 hours are very critical to treat and stabilize the condition of the patients. So this is a very high level abstraction of the patient's pathway, but it allows us to map the patient states to the data generation and also to the tasks performed by the clinicians for workload assessment. So to learn the transition rate, we need to check a couple assumptions. Here we present the observed transitions based on the actual data. The x-axis represents time in hours, and the y-axis represents the percentage of transitions to a certain state in that hour. First, we can see that after hour 6, some of the transitions become more stable. And also there is this cyclic pattern of transitions. So after consulting with the physicians, we confirmed that this is due to the operational constraints. So you can see here, most of the patients are discharged from the ICU in the afternoon. And that makes rooms for the new patients to be admitted. So we have this like cyclic pattern, and this is very salient for the state transition from state 3 to state which is discharge. So to accommodate these features, we choose a time inhomogeneous model, and we set a change point at hour 6. We also include time as a covariate after sign transformation for the seasonality effects, and we include other patient factors. We build the proportional hazard model for all the transitions. Here you can see the model performs relatively well, and the predicted patient states are close to the observed states. So for simulation implementation, we further separate the patients based on the severity of illness categorized by their SOFA score, their length of stay, and the overall level of support. So we allow for the patient type dependent transition rates in our simulation. For the patient simulation, patients will arrive to the ICU according to a prescribed arrival rate, and they will go through the admission process, and based on the states, different clinician activities will be triggered. And the order generation rates are also based on the patient states. And the tasks of different priorities are also depend on the patient state. So this is the patient part. And for the clinicians, they are also modeled as agents. And we model primarily 3 groups of clinicians. Their states are idle and not idle, and the tasks are triggered by different mechanisms. Like for certain services, they are time-based, like the physicians perform rounding twice a day, whereas for certain tasks, they are triggered by requests, like when a patient is admitted to the hospital, they need to go and perform the admission procedures. This is a sample list of the simulation inputs. So essentially, there are a lot of parameters that we need to quantify and characterize, either using data or through like domain knowledge. for this simulation, our primary goal is to understand the workload of the clinicians. So these are our primary outputs, and we can also take a look at about the dynamics of the system. So for instance, since a lot of our process implies a queuing process, we are able to see like whether the staff availability affects the time of patients to receive care. That's characterized as a delay in receiving care. We implement this in logic because it has a very good built-in support for agent synchronization. And my student recorded a video of a past version of this simulation. So I will just
Hello. I'm going to show you a demo of the medical ICU at St. Mary's Hospital at Rochester, Minnesota. In the first tab, you can see the floor map of the NICU. The patients arrived at the unit, and then the clinicians will start checking the patients and perform required tasks. The change in the patient's state is shown by the change in the color of the circles. Also, by clicking on each patient, you can see the patient's type, whether it's severe or mild, and the patient's state here in this box. We have defined a 20-day warming period. After this period, the model will start collecting the data and update the statistics for 160 days. In the next tab, we have the logic of the model. This is how we map the conceptualized model into any logic. This shows the patient flow starting with patient arrival, admission process, their stay in the unit, and at the end, patients leaving the unit. For the patients who discharged, we have one extra step here, the discharge process. In this tab, the user can customize 3 groups of model inputs. The first group is for patient-related parameters. This figure demonstrates the hourly patient arrival rate. In the current model, the pattern is fixed and repeated every day. Here, you can select which patient types with what percentage of each type to be included in the model. Then you can change the number of providers in the unit. We have defined 3 groups of providers: fellows or residents, NP or PAs, and consultants. The third group of parameters is for data. Here, the user can define data generation rates for each patient type. Let me increase the speed. With all the settings, we run the model. And now you can see the output. First, let's discuss the unit outputs. Here you can see the hourly patient census and the distribution of their lengths of stay. On the right, distribution of number of patients discharged or died are shown in these plots. And in this pie chart, we can find what percentage of total patients leaving the NICU are discharged or died so far in the model. These figures are dynamically changing as the model is running. In the next tab, the histogram of number of generated data by data category are displayed. You can find what percentage of total number of data goes to each category in this pie chart. On average, in this unit, every day, around 7,000 data are generated, and around 350 data are generated per patient per day. In the last tab, utilization of resources is provided. We have care team utilization on the left side. As it is expected, Since we have only 2 consultants and they are involved in all the tasks, most of the time they are busy compared to the other 2 groups of providers. Here, you can see that on average, we have 82% of the beds occupied in this unit. Due to the limited number of providers, the patients might not receive the required care upon request. In this plot, you can see the distribution of delay in starting the admission process in minutes. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, so for this application, we want to be able to show that what are the impact of different patient mix, like during COVID, when they're more severely ill patients, what would we expect about the low workload and the cognitive load of the physicians. And another practical use of this application is to predict the ICU sensors, as ICU sensors is directly related to a lot of operational decisions, like determining the number of nurses and the nurse assignments. So realizing the vision of an ICU digital twin will be far more challenging than that of a single patient. And even for the system modeling, I think there are a lot of questions to be answered, like what are the actual functional description of the processes and the logical description of the care delivery system needs to be identified, and we also need to determine the scope and the level of details to be modeled, like what object or what process should we include in the model, and also we need to identify the right simulation approach, like what should be modeled as system dynamics, what should be modeled as agents, and could be a multi-paradigm modeling scheme. So in terms of digital twin and simulation, I think like making a good high fidelity simulation model is only the first step, and digital twins demand multiple technologies. So like from data collection to data transfer and also to eventual data visualization, there are a lot of different technologies that a digital twin should rely on. So I think probably the takeaway message here is that we really need a collective effort in order to materialize the digital twin in a critical care application. And towards the end, I just wanted to share some lessons we learned, like when we performed this study in about 2 years ago, the data we had were primarily around the patient, but not the clinicians or the work system. So this imposes a lot of difficulties for us to get the reliable model of the individual components, and this approach, like the manual data collection approach, is definitely not sustainable or scalable. So I feel like for the digital twin to materialize, we really need to strengthen the data infrastructure, like how we get data and how we model data. And I believe like artificial intelligence plays a very important role here. And also I think a lot of the audience here are AI experts. So I really hope like this presentation can bring your attention to this critical care medicine application, where plenty of challenges and opportunities for the advancements in these technologies are waiting ahead. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you for your time.
Yeah. So let me stop recording.